Last Monday, there was a ChatGPT outage that created quite a bit of chaos that ended up then being written off largely as nothing more than an inconvenience where people weren't able to use their large language models to do the trivial things, air quote, trivial things that they typically have it do. But then I came across something else that made me think a little bit more, which was last summer in August there was a Starlink outage that left 24 US Navy autonomous vessels basically being nothing more than Navy paperweights out in the ocean, as there was absolutely no control over these things for over an hour. And as I spent time sitting thinking about all of this and the trajectory we're on right now, I couldn't help but feel like we're operating in a false middle right now where we're casually writing off and setting ourselves up for failure, believing we're too smart or too capable or too resilient to be disrupted by the systems and architecture that we're creating for ourselves, believing we're not nearly as vulnerable as these autonomous Navy vessels that were sitting off the coast of California for an hour being nothing but paperweights. But as I spend more time thinking about it, I am quickly starting to appreciate we are much more like the Navy than just inconvenienced by the occasional AI outage. Now, if you like my content, if you find value in things like this, it would mean the world to me if you like, share, subscribe, do all that good stuff. And if you find exceptionally meaningful value, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/Christopher Lind and say thank you, or check out my website to see if there's ways I can help. But that being said, this deeper reflection this week left me thinking about a lot of things that's actually inspired a two-part series. So I'm breaking it down across this week and next week to talk about the importance that we all need to be putting in fortifying our organizational fragility. And when I say I'm going to break it into two parts, this week, I'm going to spend more of the time focusing on the technical infrastructure and the way we're largely renting signal and setting ourselves up for failure with tech and the trajectory we've been on and the trajectory we're on that's contributing to this. Then next week, I'm actually going to take it through the lens of the human angle, because there's a lot of things happening as it comes to the way we're thinking about treating and operating with people that are following a very similar path and making us equally vulnerable. So I would highly encourage you to stick around both this week and next to hear how fragile organizations are becoming as we continue moving on the current trajectory we're on, and hear why and what you can do about it to hopefully prevent yourself from becoming a victim of this whole thing. So let's start on this week's the technical piece. Okay. So we're going to talk about kind of the rented infrastructure and dashboard delusion that many organizations are now operating on. Now, this requires a little bit of a trip down memory lane because this isn't all new. This isn't all something that just happened in 2022 when ChatGPT launched and everybody became obsessed with AI. This really largely goes back to the early 2000s when we started looking at SaaS, when SaaS, software as a service, really started getting its footing. And, we, rather than dealing with if you haven't been around the technical side of things, technical infrastructure is expensive. It's hard to maintain. It's vulnerable a lot of times, and it's kind of a royal pain in the rear. And that's really where SaaS started. Was a lot of companies saw this challenge and said, it's difficult for organizations to manage all of this internally, to have the infrastructure, the teams, the support, all this. What if we did it? What if we did it for people, and rather than them having to deal with all of this infrastructure, we hosted, we managed all of these services, and people simply leased it from us? We'll put the servers in our closet and offer people the convenience of a cloud. They don't need to have that in their organization. They don't need to manage that. And, it'll be a reasonable trade for speed and risk. We'll take on that risk. We'll put some guarantees in place for speed. And in return, you pay us a regular subscription, and you don't have to deal with that. You'll still need some level of IT support, but it'll be less. You won't have to worry about maintenance, security, and all this. And in many cases, this made sense. It really did. To maintain and manage some of the technical infrastructure for some of these one-off things, especially in the early days where companies were not nearly as digital as they are today, managing and maintaining an entire infrastructure around it was not necessarily the best move for organizations. And so SaaS presented a really compelling offer, and it was resisted big time initially. So it's not like everybody just all got it and went, yay, let's bring in SaaS. It was a major transition. And I remember being there through all of this, working with a software company that was in the process of helping healthcare organizations take some of that internal infrastructure off of their organizational books and move it on to ours. And there were no shortage of challenges in doing it, but it made sense. Largely, for the most part, it did. And so SaaS started becoming the default. And if you haven't followed the technical sphere, you may not be aware of all this. But what happened is, as companies started to become more and more dependent on digital infrastructure, the CFO started seeing some of the costs that came with this. And if you were to look at an organizational budget or how companies run right now, you would very quickly see this. And all of a sudden, the CFO looks at a financial report and sees how much money is being spent on apps and subscription services that run the organization, and they tend to freak out. And what happens is, because of the complex nature of organizations, a lot of times the CTO or the chief technical officer or CIO, they start to lose sight of some of this architecture. Now, even in the most well-managed IT firms and orgs that I've worked with, this becomes a very difficult thing as companies start to scale, because different orgs bring in their own systems that they need for different things. Different functions do within different teams. It's so easy to spin up things and put them on purchasing cards and things like this. And so before you know it, you have massive, highly complex ecosystems of applications that are all managed services. You don't actually own any of this stuff that you're paying massive amounts of money for, and you really have lost complete control over what this is. And it really becomes a rat's nest of technical infrastructure. Now, I'm very aware of this problem because I've largely been involved with this, and I've had a number of organizations that have called me in to help with some of this. In fact, my time where I went to GE, when I moved into a global role, one of my number one responsibilities was to try and dig in and understand the rat's nest of technology that was being used across the entire organization and make sense of it. Because before long, you start having duplicate applications, you have different functions running on different things, contracts are managed through different things, security is managed through different things. And over time, not only does it become very expensive, it becomes a huge organizational risk. And at some point, it eventually hits somebody who freaks out. And what also becomes further complex as you start to dig into this, because in this situation, it often happens where companies will start to see this and they'll start to recognize, hey, we probably should get a handle on this. Maybe we can cut some of these things back. We have 17 of this same kind of system. Do we really need 17 of them? Maybe we only need 1 or 2 or 3, whatever. And organizations, rightfully so, want to try and simplify this complex mess, thinking it should be nothing more than an organizational shift. We'll just migrate people over from one system to the other and then consolidate things down, end contracts, and call it a day. And on the surface, it seems like that. And I've done this many times where I get brought in to go, hey, how do we consolidate this? This should be a onesie twosie, ask some questions, figure out how we do it, and then cut contracts and move forward. But I remember one situation in particular where, as these systems become more complex and the organizations need to interact with each other and the functions need to work together, you may have heard of something called an API. Now, to my technical friends, you'll be like, Christopher, why are you breaking it down this simple? But I have a pretty diverse audience. And you may not realize that a lot of these systems, people struggle because the systems aren't getting their full functionality because they don't have all of the necessary data. some of the data they need is coming from different systems in different parts of the organization. And naturally, because these systems become more complex, you have the same kinds of systems and you need that data to be shared. So people create these APIs to share data. And I remember one specific situation where we thought this should be relatively easy to consolidate this thing, only to realize that some of these critical systems were actually nothing more than a user interface for a different system. So there were two systems, but the one system that actually had all the data where all the work was being done was not the system people were working through. That data was being passed through and then used on this other thing simply because the user interface and the overall customer relationship was stronger with this. So now we couldn't actually, we could, but it became infinitely more complex as we tried to break this down. And so in many cases, what many organizations don't realize is over this journey since the early 2000s to the early 2020s, we were moving from software as a service, outsourcing some of our IT infrastructure, to dependency was our strategy. We no longer are going to own or manage any of our own stuff. We're going to relegate all of that to these software providers. And as the rat's nest became more tangled, we become so interdependent that actually almost becomes the strategy as we move forward. And this makes us exceptionally vulnerable. Now, this is where we were. Mind you, I just said from a timeline standpoint, we're talking early 2000s to early 2020s. Well, this is just segment one. And I can tell you from the work that I've done over the years, we didn't have this under control. This was already organizational fragility in many cases. And many organizations don't realize how fragile they are till something breaks or something goes sideways or someone doesn't renew a contract because they don't want to spend the budget anymore, not realizing how dependent many other systems and functions are on that system, and the whole thing collapses. So this was already a major risk for many organizations of any, even small to medium businesses were running into this early 2020s. This was becoming a major organizational risk. We're now moving into what I would call the fragility multiplier. We're moving into a new age where this risk that I just described that's been building for almost 2 decades, I talk all the time about AI as an amplifier, as an accelerant. Well, we are moving in the multiplier age where this is going to go off the rails if we don't pay close attention to it and at least take a concerted effort to try and stop it. Because we're not now, for the most part, you look at most organizations, they're almost fully dependent on SaaS. Very few organizations actually own their own technological infrastructure. They may have some basic stuff, but largely we've completely moved off on-prem technology infrastructure. There's a little bit of a shift back as AI has kind of made it easier to spin up your own stuff, but largely we're not swinging back the full way. So now we're not just adding more apps, which that's still happening. The rat's nest is still getting more and more tangled as now people have AI subscriptions. They have even more application subscriptions than they had before. They have agents creating vibe-coded apps that technically they don't even have the infrastructure to support. They're just spinning these things up. It's not being fully embedded into the ecosystem. And then they don't even realize that that's vulnerable because they need the SaaS AI product that they use to build it to fix the thing that they just built that they're now becoming dependent on. So this is already amplifying exponentially in and of itself. But now, as we're moving into the age of AI agents and physicality of technological infrastructure, largely through robotics and the Internet of Things, IoT, internet-connected devices, this is only going to accelerate even further. So as we're in 2026 right now, it's not that we just largely don't own the apps and the software services that we have. We're also moving into a place where we have AI agents running and managing all of the relationships and the work happening on these rented systems that don't even belong to us. But then on top of it, you have robotics. Even now, GPUs as a service, compute as a service is becoming a new thing. The AI models that we're using to run all of this stuff is largely not being run on our own servers, on our own. It's not our own proprietary model. It's something that we're leasing from one of these big tech companies. The hardware itself, I know one organization that made a huge shift where the machines that their employees were using really did not even run independently. They were all connecting into leased desktops and things like that. So technically, the machine itself was a hollow shell. It couldn't even run its own OS and applications because it was all tied into all this stuff. And it's largely this pendulum of swinging into a complete world where the intelligence of our company, the day-to-day operations of our company running minute by minute is completely leased and completely outside of our control and completely managed by an entire portfolio of organizations that we have little to no control over and are governed by nothing more than fairly weak terms of service. So this is, like I said, this is continuing to project, because if you look at the trajectory we're on right now, as organizations are pushing really hard to move towards agentic workflows. And when I say agentic workflows, I'm talking about, using AI agents to run a lot of what's happening in these rented services, these rented applications. And again, these agents are not ours. We do not own them. They do not belong to us. They are leased on these AI platforms that they're bringing in, that are often being run and managed off leased compute servers and data centers that don't belong to us. So this is something that now we had a real serious problem. So we built like 21st century skyscrapers on a 20th century foundation, and we're using tools to run and manage this skyscraper that we've got to return every night. Or if there's an outage that happens, we literally have zero access or capability to any of this. And now layer on top of that, those things are being run and managed by autonomous agents, autonomous systems, lease systems that we literally have no control over. So I say this not necessarily to freak people out, but this really to be a bit of a canary in the coal mine moment to say, hey, from a technology standpoint, this was already a major risk to almost every organization I engaged with and worked with. And largely, they were not paying much attention to it until it hit a point of serious risk that they had to manage. Well, we're turning up the volume on a problem that we already did not have control over, and we're adding new layers. Going back to that skyscraper analogy, we're building more layers on top of this same kind of infrastructure, on this same trajectory. The concrete hasn't even set. And oh, by the way, it's a leased property, and the I-beams, the copper wire, the plumbing in it, it actually doesn't belong to us either. And we're building this skyscraper that is extremely, extremely fragile. Now, I share all this in some ways to hopefully not freak you out, but in some ways make you go, hold on a second. I had not necessarily considered the implications of all of this. And like I said, next week, I'm going to talk about how we're doing this even with the people in our organization, but that's a conversation for another week. But my goal is to hopefully help you go, okay, hang on. Now that I'm processing and thinking through this, yes, this is a gap that largely makes sense, already existed. I now see how we're doing this, but hopefully it has you going, okay, so what? How do we respond? Because the reality is, I can tell you right now, you can't just go undo this. And I've worked with enough organizations who, even on their most bold days, have said, that's it. We're cutting, XYZ dollars out of this, or we're going to cut X number of Z systems out of the system. And by the time you get into it and start untangling this nest, you realize maybe we can, but this is a multi-year plan. This is a multi-million-dollar initiative that we've got ourselves into that we didn't plan for and are not prepared for. So this isn't just something where you go, hey, when the contract is up, let's just end it and see what happens. And there is largely a perception that people believe that, well, it'll be fine. We'll just end this and it'll work itself out. And what I'm trying to tell you is the work itself out vulnerability is only becoming more and more significant. The consequences of taking that approach are only going to become worse. Now, that leaves hopefully by this point, I've got your attention and you're interested in, so what do we do about it? Because the reality is you can't just undo it. We can't. We're too far into it. And with the way things are right now, I don't see us, and I don't think it's wise, with a few exceptions. And in a lot of the consulting work I do, this is where I'll figure out some of the nuance. But largely, my recommendation is let's go back to the good old days. Let's go back to the days of yore when we used to own all of our technical infrastructure and manage all of that internally. No, because I will tell you right now, that came with loads of its own risk. You want to talk about companies that were exceptionally vulnerable to cybercrime because they didn't even remember to run their Windows updates or, keep their servers up to date or make sure they had the latest versions of the software that they had purchased, type of a thing. Or, employee bases that were running on 10-year-old tech because they still needed to, their IT company hadn't gotten budget to upgrade their email server, type of it. Let me be clear. Let's not pretend the days of yore were the glory days where everything was wonderful and there was no business fragility. There was a different layer of fragility that existed that largely a lot of the tech we're seeing right now did help solve. Unfortunately, because many organizations did not take the time to thoroughly understand this and it moved so fast, we swung so far over, it became so far out of control. And now we're layering on an accelerant to this problem that is going to take us to the point of no return if we don't do something. So that brings us to the point of, so what do we do? Now, the first thing I will tell you is most organizations don't even know their current stack. And I think this is a really important exercise for every business IT leader. This really should probably be a cross-functional. Whenever I've done this in organizations, we've sometimes started within a single function and then quickly expanded it to be a cross-functional, potentially full organization, depending on the size of the organization, to see how we can pull this together. But most organizations don't even have a map of what they have. And a good place to start with this is with your financial leaders, who can help you understand what contracts are in place, and your IT leaders to see what some of these things are. Now, the reason I say you need both is if you're going just to your technical leaders to find this stuff out, there's a lot of rogue tech that goes under the radar that most tech leaders don't even know about. There's subscriptions being paid for on budgets that never went through the proper technical channels. And so you need that balance of what dollars are actually going out, when are contracts up for renewal, how much money are we actually spending on all this stuff, alongside and paired with your IT leaders who can actually tell you what's actually in our managed services. What are the things we currently have resources and infrastructure to support? This will start to give you an idea of the gap, because a lot of times people just run out to start saying, hey, let's go talk to the people and see how they're using it before they really fully understand the map that they're working with. And so the first step, I would encourage every organization, and I'm telling you this right now, if you are operating off assumptions, which many organizations, basically everyone I've ever encountered, is operating off some degree of assumptions here. They're operating off what they think they know. You need to know this, and you need to know it now more than you ever have. And if this is something you've said, yeah, we really should do this, and you've kicked it down the road, stop kicking it down the road like yesterday. This should quickly move up to the top of your priority list before you start amplifying this problem beyond your control. And so if the thought of mapping these dependencies makes you want to quit, give me a call. I actually enjoy this kind of work. I enjoy partnering between the businesses and the IT partners to try and say, let's make sense of this. What's really here, so that we understand. And I think, unfortunately, for many years, we've all kind of known this was a problem, but nobody really wanted to lift up the rock and see what was underneath it because we knew it was bad. And we thought maybe if we just pretend it's not there, we won't have to deal with it. but we've reached a point, and we've long past reached the point where that is foolishness. And so my call to action for every organization right now is make this a priority with somewhere. Make this a priority, put work, commit dollars to this, because now is the time to do your best to get in front of it. And even if you think, yeah, I think we have one, now's the time to double check. So maybe you did this exercise a couple years ago and you think, yeah, I think we have a good feel for this. Well, I can tell you right now, it's out of date. And I recognize this is not going to be something that you're probably ever going to fully be able to control, but you do need to have some semblance of an idea of what your map is, so that you can move to step 2, which step 2, once you go through the exercise of figuring out what is in your ecosystem, how much money are we actually spending on this? How many duplicate systems do we actually have? How much rogue tech is actually in our organization that we're paying for that we didn't realize that we had? Do that exercise so that 2, you can start to do your signal path stress test. How vulnerable? The whole point of this episode series is to talk about organizational fragility. If you don't have a map, I assure you there is no way you can actually assess how fragile are you actually. Once you get that map, you can start to do a fragility map. Now, one critical miss that I see in every organization I engage with where we talk about this is you do not want to do this in parallel with step 1. I mean, there might be a little bit of overlap, but one of the most critical mistakes people make is they go, well, let's do this like map of what we have, and let's also try and assess how vulnerable and weak and where there might be duplication at the same time. And I'm telling you, it's not the right path. You will end up overloaded, and you actually will end up trying to tackle too much at once, and you won't be able to get the detail you need because you don't have the full picture. You need to, at least to some degree, have a full map, or at least a decent coloring in of a map before you start going in and going, let's see how much fragility we have in here. How weak are we? And not only, how much duplication. That used to be the CFO question. How much duplication do we have? How much fat can we cut out of the system? Yeah, that's an important question to ask, but it's also an important question to ask, how vulnerable are these systems? Like, how many of these systems run in true total isolation that if you were to remove them out, you're not cutting the head off a Hydra, that there's just 8 other things, or the whole thing would implode. 8 other systems would go down with it because of, that's actually the root system that everybody's pulling from. You can't do that until you understand what the map is. And so being able to assess not only, hey, what is the interconnectedness of this data, of this IT infrastructure, but also how vulnerable are we to, these kinds of things? Like, how many of these systems are tied to a single, let's just say, Amazon Web Services? So if Amazon went down, how much of your ecosystem would actually be taken with it? How much of it is on Azure? How much of it is on Google Web Services, type of a thing? And I think that's one of the things that, we have to start asking is, it's not just about the cost. It's about how is the data structured. So we recognize, okay, they're all SaaSes, but all SaaSes end up being spread across a different distribution list. And you need to be able to map, how dependent are we? And do we have backup plans for this? And I think this gets to step 3, and where I'll wrap is actually starting to say, okay, so now that we know what our map is, now that we've identified what our data, infrastructure looks like and what our key vulnerabilities are, I promise you, you're not going to be able to fix this overnight. This will not be something that you say, let's try and get this knocked out by, Q3 of 2026. You won't. This is going to be potentially a multi-year thing, even just with contracts expiring and all this other stuff. There's a lot of work that goes into how you prioritize this. So don't try and fix everything at once, but try and identify what are your core resilience gaps that wouldn't just cause a little bit of chaos, but could potentially sink the ship, and actually do some work to prioritize, where are you fragile? Where are you vulnerable to these things? And what can you do to try and shore that up? And some of it may be, how do we clean up our data infrastructure? How do we clean up our digital rat's nest of tools? Some of it is, hey, do we actually have manual overrides and ways we can operate some of this stuff in the event some of these things do go down. Because as we saw last Monday, things do go down. And if you've built an entire ecosystem, I mean, it was bad enough when it was all just SaaSes. Look what happened when like Cloudflare, went offline, or, some of these AWSs go offline. Watch how it takes down an organization. Now stack on top of that, imagine what happens when you've got AI agents running a lot of that stuff. Actual work is tied to all of this. And then those AI systems go down, or they go rogue, or something happens. You need to be able to prioritize, where do we build in some manual overrides to ensure we aren't potentially sinking our entire organizational ship because we didn't even realize we didn't own anything, and nothing we do actually is able to run independently of itself. And so that may sound like a lot, and it is. And like I said, if you need help with it, let me know. But that is a consistent pattern or path that you can walk to start to get some of this organizational fragility under control from a technical standpoint, to be able to actually start to get your arms around it. Like I said, it's not something you're going to be able to do overnight, but it is something that you can start making progress on. And if you start moving down these 3 steps, you will start to see, it's a mess under the rock. And I assure you that it's not as bad as you may be thinking if you just listen to this and it's the first time you really thought about it or haven't put a lot of time and effort into thinking about it. It's probably not as bad as you're imagining catastrophizing in your head. It's a lot worse than you realize, though. I will tell you that. In every instance where I've done this work, it is always worse than people realize, even in small organizations where they think, we don't really run, we're not a digital organization. We don't have that much digital infrastructure. That's what you think until you actually start looking. And I think that's why I say, number 1 is stop operating off assumptions. Make sure you actually know that you're operating off good, hard data and facts around the way your organization is actually built and the way it actually runs. Because this dashboard delusion, thinking that your organization is running fine because you've got a nice, clean dashboard that has a bunch of green status lights on it that tells you everything's in place and you're in complete control, is a level of organizational fragility most organizations they're not prepared for should something happen. And again, if you need help, I get it. It's a lot. Give me a call. It's not as bad as you might be catastrophizing right now, but it is worse than you think. So fix it. Don't just leave it and hope it'll go away. It won't. It's only going to get worse. And the worse it gets, the more vulnerable you become. Now, that's this week's. Okay, that's this week's topic on the technical trajectory we've been on and how that's making your organization fragile. Come back next week, because next week I want to talk about the trajectory we're on right now from a people and skills standpoint that is having this same effect. We're on the same trajectory, and we're now also layering on the same amplified, accelerant onto the problems that we currently have. And it's going to put us in this same fragile state. And so now you're talking about 2 catastrophic organizational vulnerabilities that have the potential to completely take you out if you don't get your arms around it and do something about it. So hopefully this was helpful. It gives you something to take action on, but don't stop here. Don't think because you got the tech under control, you're in a good spot. The human side of this is equally, I'm not going to say more or less, it's equally important, and it's equally overlooked in every organization I've ever engaged with. So be sure to join me next week. I look forward to it. And with that, I'm Christopher Lind. This has been Future Focused, and we will see you back here next week to talk about the human side of it.